Welcome back, friends. I'm Annabelle, and I'm here to read. First, we're going to read a work of classic literature together, and then we're gonna talk about what we read, because I just happen to have a lot of opinions about everything. The best pizza is a classic margarita pizza with the basil and the tomato. So if you would like to follow along with the text, I always link a copy of an ebook down in the video description box, or you can just enable captions. While you're down there in the video description box, there are a bunch of source links to different interesting information, a biography of the author that we're reading that week, and a bunch of other stuff, along with the subscribe button, which you might want to hit that while you're down there. Tonight we're reading is it The Angel? Yes. Tonight we're reading The Angel at the Grave by Edith Wharton. 1. The house stood a few yards back from the elm-shaded village street in that semi-publicity is sometimes cited as a democratic protest against old-world standards of domestic exclusiveness. This candid exposure to the public eye is more probably a result of the gregariousness which, in the New England bosom, oddly coexists with a shrinking from direct social contact, most of the intimates of such houses preferring that furtive intercourse which is the result of observations through shuttered windows and a categorical acquaintance with the neighboring clotheslines. The house, however, faced its public with a difference. For 60 years it had written itself with a capital letter, had self-consciously squared itself in the eye of an admiring nation. The most searching inroads of village intimacy hardly counted in a household that opened on the universe, and a lady whose doorbell was at any moment liable to be rung by visitors from London or Vienna was not likely to flutter upstairs when she observed a neighbor stepping over. The solitary inmate of the Anson house owed this induration of the social texture to the most conspicuous accident in her annals, the fact that she was the only granddaughter of the great Orestes Anson. She had been born, as it were, into a museum, and cradled in a glass case with a label, the first foundations of her consciousness being built on the rock of her grandfather's celebrity. To a little girl who acquires her earliest knowledge of literature through a reader embellished with fragments of her ancestors' prose, that personage necessarily fills a heroic space in the foreground of life. To communicate with one's past through the impressive medium of print, to have, as it were, a footing in every library in the country, and an acknowledged kinship with that world-diffused clan, the descendants of the great, was to be pledged to a standard of manners that amazingly simplified the lesser relations of life. The village street on which Paulina Anson's youth looked out led to all the capitals of Europe, and over the roads of intercommunication unseen caravans bore back to the elm-shaded house the tribute of an admiring world. Fate seemed to have taken a direct share in fitting Paulina for her part as the custodian of this historic dwelling. It had long been secretly regarded as a, quote, visitation by the great man's family that he left no son, and that his daughters were not, quote, intellectual. The ladies themselves were the first to limit their deficiency, to own that nature had denied them the gift of making the most of their opportunities. A profound veneration for their parent and an unswerving faith in his doctrines had not amended their congenial incapacity to understand what he had written. Laura, who had her moments of mute rebellion against destiny, had sometimes thought how much easier it would have been if their progenitor had been a poet, for she could recite, with feeling, portions of the Culprit Fay and of the poems of Mrs. Hemans, and Phoebe, who was more conspicuous for memory than imagination, kept an album filled with, quote, selections. But the great man was a philosopher, and to both daughters respiration was difficult on the cloudy heights of metaphysic. The situation would have been intolerable but for the fact that, while Phoebe and Laura were still at school, their father's fame had passed from the open ground of conjecture to the chill privacy of certitude. Dr. Anson had in fact achieved one of those anticipated immortalities not uncommon at a time when people were apt to base their literary judgments on their emotions, and when to affect plain food and despise England went a long way toward establishing a man's intellectual preeminence. Thus, when the daughters were called on to strike a filial attitude about their parents' pedestal, there was little to do but to pose gracefully and point upward, and there are spines to which the immobility of worship is not a strain. A legend had by this time crystallized about the great Orestes, and it was of more immediate interest to the public to hear what brand of tea he drank and whether he took off his boots in the hall than to rouse the drowsy echo of his dialectic. A great man never draws so near his public as when it has become unnecessary to read his books, and is still interesting to know what he eats for breakfast. As recorders of their parents' domestic habits, as pious scavengers of his wastepaper basket, the Misses Anson were unexcelled. They always had an interesting anecdote to impart to the literary pilgrim, and the tact with which, in later years, they intervened between the public and the growing inaccessibility of its idol, sent away many enthusiasts satisfied to have touched the veil before the sanctuary. Still, it was felt, especially by old Mrs. Anson, who survived her husband for some years, that Phoebe and Laura were not worthy of their privileges. There had been a third daughter so unworthy of hers that she had married a distant cousin who had taken her to live in a new western community where the works of Orestes Anson had not yet become a part of the civic consciousness. But of this daughter little was said, and she was tacitly understood to be excluded from the family heritage of fame. In time, however, it appeared that the traditional penny with which she had been cut off had been invested to unexpected advantage, and the interest on it, when she died, returned to the Anson house in the shape of a granddaughter, who was at once felt to be what Mrs. Anson called a compensation. It was Mrs. Anson's firm belief that the remotest operations of nature were governed by the centripetal force of her husband's greatness, and that Paulina's exceptional intelligence could be explained only on the ground that she was designed to act as the guardian of the family temple. The house, by the time Paulina came to live in it, had already acquired the publicity of a place of worship, not the perfumed chapel of a romantic idolatry, but the cold, clean, empty meeting-house of ethical enthusiasms. The ladies lived on its outskirts, as it were, in cells that left the central fane undisturbed. The very position of the furniture had come to have a ritual significance. The sparse ornaments were the offerings of kindred intellects. The steel engravings by Raphael Morgan marked the via sacra of a European tour, and the black walnut desk with its bronze inkstand modeled on the Pantheon was the altar of this bleak temple of thought. To a child compact of enthusiasms and accustomed to pasture them on the scanty herbage of a new social soil, the atmosphere of the old house was full of floating nourishment. In the compressed perspective of Paulina's outlook, it stood for a monument of ruined civilizations, and its white portico opened on legendary distances. Its very aspect was impressive to the eyes that first surveyed life from the jigsaw residence of a raw-edged western town. The high-ceilinged rooms, with their paneled walls, their polished mahogany, their portraits of triple-stocked ancestors and of ringleted females in crayon, furnished the child with a historic scenery against which a young imagination constructs its vision of the past. To other eyes, the cold, spotless, thinly furnished interior might have suggested the shuttered mind of a maiden lady who associates fresh air and sunlight with dust and discoloration. But it is the eye which supplies the coloring matter, and Paulina's brimmed with the richest hues. Nevertheless, the house did not immediately dominate her. She had her confused out-teachings toward other centers of sensation, her vague intuition of a heliocentric system, but the attraction of habit, the steady pressure of example, gradually fixed her roving alliance, and she bent her neck to the yoke. Vanity had a share in her subjugation, for it had been early discovered that she was the only person in the family who could read her grandfather's works. The fact that she had perused them with delight at an age when, even presupposing a metaphysical bias, it was impossible for her to understand them, seemed to her aunts and grandmother sure evidence of predestination. Paulina was to be the interpreter of the oracle, and the philosophic fumes so vertiginous to meaner minds would throw her into needed condition of clairvoyance. Nothing could have been more genuine than the emotion on which this theory was based. Paulina, in fact, delighted in her grandfather's writings. His sonorous periods, his mystic vocabulary, his bold flights into the rarefied air of the abstract were thrilling to a fancy unhampered by the need of definitions. This purely verbal pleasure was supplemented later by the excitement of gathering up crumbs of meaning from the rhetorical board. What could have been more stimulating than to construct the theory of a girlish world out of the fragments of this titanic cosmogony? Before Paulina's opinions had reached the age when ossification sets in, their form was fatally predetermined. The fact that Dr. Anson had died and that his apotheosis had taken place before his young priestess's induction to the temple made her ministrations easier and more inspiring. There were no little personal traits, such as the great man's manner of helping himself to salt, or the guttural cluck that started the wheels of speech, to distract the eye of young veneration from the central fact of his divinity. A man whom one knows only through a crayon portrait and a dozen yellowing tomes on free will and intuition is at least secure from the belittling effects of intimacy. Paulina thus grew up in a world readjusted to the fact of her grandfather's greatness, and as each organism draws from its surroundings the kind of nourishment most needful to its growth, so from this somewhat colorless conception she absorbed warmth, brightness, and variety. Paulina was the type of woman who transmutes thought into sensation and nurses a theory in her bosom like a child. In due course, Mrs. Anson, quote-unquote, passed away. No one died in the Anson vocabulary, and Paulina became more than ever the foremost figure of the commemorative group. Laura and Phoebe, content to leave their father's glory in more competent hands, placidly lapsed into needlework and fiction, and their niece stepped into immediate prominence as the chief authority on the great man. Historians who were getting up the period wrote to consult her and to borrow documents. Ladies with inexplicable yearnings begged for an interpretation of phrases which had influenced them, but which they had not quite understood. Critics applied to her to verify some doubtful citation or decide some disputed point in chronology, and the great tide of thought and investigation kept up a continuous murmur on the quiet shores of her life. An explorer of another kind disembarked there one day in the shape of a young man to whom Paulina was primarily a kissable girl, with an afterthought in the shape of a grandfather. From the outset it had been impossible to fix Hewlett Winslow's attention on Dr. Anson. The young man behaved with the innocent profanity of infants sporting on a tomb. His excuse was that he came from New York, a Sumerian outskirt which survived in Paulina's geography only because Dr. Anson had gone there once or twice to lecture. The curious thing was that she should have thought it worthwhile to find excuses for young Winslow. The fact that she did so had not escaped the attention of the village, but people, after a gasp of awe, said it was the most natural thing in the world that a girl like Paulina Anson should think of burying. It would certainly seem a little odd to see a man in the house, but young Winslow would of course understand that the doctor's books were not to be disturbed and that he must go down to the orchard to smoke. The village had barely framed this modus vivendi when it was convulsed by the announcement that young Winslow declined to live in the house on any terms. Hang going down to the orchard to smoke. He meant to take his wife to New York. The village drew its breath and watched. Did Persephone, snatched from the warm fields of Enna, peer half-consentingly down the abyss that opened at her feet? Paulina, it must be owned, hung a moment over the black gulf of temptation. She would have found it easy to cope with a deliberate disregard of her grandfather's rights, but young Winslow's unconsciousness of that shadowy claim was as much a natural function as the falling of leaves on a grave. His love was an embodiment of the perpetual renewal to which some tender spirits seems a crueler process than decay. On women of Paulina's mold, this piety toward implicit demands, toward the ghosts of dead duties walking unappeased among usurping passions, has a stronger hold than any tangible bond. People said that she gave up young Winslow because her aunts disapproved of her leaving them, but such disapproval as reached her was an emanation from the walls of the house, from the bare desk, the faded portraits, the dozen yellowing tomes that no hand but hers had ever lifted from the shelf. 2. After that, the house possessed her. As if conscious of its victory, it imposed a conqueror's claims. It had once been suggested that she should write a life of her grandfather, and the task from which she had shrunk as from a too oppressive privilege now shaped itself into a justification of her course. In a burst of filial pantheism, she tried to lose herself in the vast ancestral consciousness. Her one refuge from skepticism was a blind faith in the magnitude and the endurance of the idea to which she had sacrificed her life, and with a passionate instinct of self-preservation she labored to fortify her position. The preparations for the life led her through byways that the most scrupulous of the previous biographers had left unexplored. She accumulated her material with a blind animal patience unconscious of fortuitous risks. The years stretched before her like some vast blank page spread out to receive the record of her toil, and she had a mystic conviction that she would not die till her work was accomplished. The aunts, sustained by no such high purpose, withdrew in turn to their respective divisions of the Anson plot, and Paulina remained alone with her task. She was 40 when the book was completed. She had traveled little in her life, and it had become more and more difficult for her to leave the house, even for a day, but the dread of entrusting her document to a strange hand made her decide to carry it herself to the publisher. On the way to Boston, she had a sudden vision of the loneliness to which this last parting condemned her. All her youth, all her dreams, all her renunciations lay in that neat bundle on her knee. It was not so much her grandfather's life as her own that she had written, and the knowledge that it would come back to her in all the glorification of print was of no more help than, to a mother's grief, the assurance that the lad she must part with will return with epaulets. She had naturally addressed herself to the firm which had published her grandfather's works. Its founder, a personal friend of the philosopher's, had survived the Olympian group of which he had been a subordinate member, long enough to bestow his octogenarian approval on Paulina's pious undertaking. But he had died soon afterward, and Miss Anson found herself confronted by his grandson, a person with a brisk commercial view of his trade, who was said to have put new blood into the firm. This gentleman listened attentively, fingering her manuscript as though literature was a tactile substance. Then, with a confidential twist of his revolving chair, he emitted the verdict. "We ought to have had this 10 years sooner." Miss Anson took the words as an allusion to the repressed avidity of her readers. "It has been a long time for the public to wait," she solemnly assented. The publisher smiled. "They haven't waited," he said. She looked at him strangely. "Haven't waited?" "No, they've gone off, taken another train. Literature is like a big railway station now, you know. There's a train starting every minute. People are not going to want to hang around the waiting room. If they can't get to a place when they want to, they'll go somewhere else." The application of this parable cost Miss Anson several minutes of throbbing silence. At length she said, "Then am I to understand that the public is no longer interested in my grandfather?" She felt as though heaven must blast the lips that risked such a conjecture. "Well, it's this way. He's a name still, of course. People don't exactly want to be caught not knowing who he is, but they don't want to spend $2 finding out when they can look him up for nothing in any biographical dictionary." Miss Anson's world reeled. She felt herself adrift among mysterious forces, and no more thought of prolonging the discussion than of opposing an earthquake with argument. She went home carrying the manuscript like a wounded thing. On the return journey, she found herself traveling straight toward a fact that had lurked for months in the background of her life, and that now seemed to await her on the very threshold. The fact that fewer visitors came to the house. She owed to herself that for the last 4 or 5 years the number had steadily diminished. Engrossed in her work, she had noticed the change only to feel thankful she had fewer interruptions. There had been a time when, at the traveling season, the bell rang continuously, and the ladies of the house lived in a chronic state of best silks and expectancy. It would have been impossible then to carry on any consecutive work, and she saw now that the silence which had gathered around her task had been the hush of death. Not of his death. The very walls cried out against the implication. It was the world's enthusiasm, the world's faith, the world's loyalty that had died. A corrupt generation that had turned aside to worship the brazen serpent. Her heart yearned with a prophetic passion over the lost sheep straying in the wilderness. But all great glories had their interlunar period, and in due time her grandfather would once more flash full-orbed upon a darkling world. The few friends to whom she confided her adventure reminded her with tender indignation that there were other publishers less subject to the fluctuations of the market. But much as she had braved for her grandfather, she could not again brave that particular probation. She found herself, in fact, incapable of any immediate effort. She had lost her way in a labyrinth of conjecture where her worst dread was that she might put her hand upon the clue. She locked up the manuscript and sat down to wait. If a pilgrim had come just then, the priestess would have fallen on his neck, but she continued to celebrate her rites alone. It was a double solitude, for she had always thought a great deal more of the people who came to see the house than of the people who came to see her. She fancied that the neighbors kept a keen eye on the path to the house, and there were days when the figure of a stranger strolling past the gate seemed to focus upon her the scorching sympathies of the village. For a time she thought of traveling, of going to Europe, or even to Boston, but to leave the house now would have seemed like deserting her post. Gradually her scattered energies centered themselves in the fierce resolve to understand what had happened. She was not the woman to live long in an unmapped country, or to accept as final her private interpretation of phenomena. Like a traveler in unfamiliar regions, she began to store for future guidance the minutest natural signs. Unflinchingly, she noted the accumulating symptoms of indifference that marked her grandfather's descent toward posterity. She passed from the heights on which he had been grouped with the sages of his day to the lower level where he had come to be, quote, the friend of Emerson, the correspondent of Hawthorne, or, later still, the Dr. Anson, mentioned in their letters. The change had taken place as slowly and imperceptibly as a natural process. She could not say that any ruthless hand had stripped the leaves from the tree. It was simply that, among the evergreen glories of his group, her grandfather's had proved deciduous. She had still to ask herself why. If the decay had been a natural process, was it not the very pledge of renewal? It was easier to find such arguments than to be convinced by them. Again and again, she tried to drug her solicitude with analogies, but at last she saw that such expedients were but the expression of a growing incredulity. The best way of proving her faith in her grandfather was not to be afraid of his critics. She had no notion where these shadowy antagonists lurked, for she had never heard of the great man's doctrine being directly combated. Oblique assaults there must have been, however, Parthian shots at the great giant that none dared face, and she thirsted to close with such assailants. The difficulty was to find them. She began by rereading the works. Thence she passed to the writers of the same school, those whose rhetoric bloomed perennial in first readers, from which her grandfather's prose had long since faded. Amid that clamor of far-off enthusiasm, she detected no controversial note. The little knot of Olympians held their views in common with an early Christian promiscuity. They were continually proclaiming their admiration for each other, the public joining as chorus in this guileless antiphon of praise, and she discovered no traitor in their midst. What, then, had happened? Was it simply the main current of thought had set another way? Then why did the others survive? Why were they still marked down as tributaries to the philosophic stream? This question carried her still farther afield, and she pressed on with the passion of a champion whose reluctance to know the worst might be construed into a doubt of his cause. At length, slowly but inevitably, an explanation shaped itself. Death had overtaken the doctrines about which her grandfather had draped his cloudy rhetoric. They had disintegrated and been reabsorbed, adding their little pile to the dust drifted about the mute lips of the Sphinx. The great man's contemporaries had survived not by reason of what they taught, but of what they were, and he who had been the mere mask through which they mouthed their lesson, the instrument on which their tune was played, lay buried deep among the obsolete tools of thought. The discovery came to Paulina suddenly. She looked up one evening from her reading, and it stood before her like a ghost. It had entered her life with stealthy steps, creeping close before she was aware of it. She sat in the library, among the carefully tended books and portraits, and it seemed to her that she had been walled alive into a tomb hung with the effigies of dead ideas. She felt a desperate longing to escape into the outer air, where people toiled and loved, and living sympathies went hand in hand. It was the sense of wasted labor that oppressed her, of 2 lives consumed in that ruthless process that uses generations of effort to build a single cell. There was a dreary parallel between her grandfather's fruitless toil and her own unprofitable sacrifice. Each, in turn, had kept vigil by a corpse. 3. The bell rang, she remembered it afterward, with a loud, thrilling note. It was what they used to call the visitor's ring, not the tentative tinkle of a neighbor dropping in to borrow a saucepan or discuss parochial incidents, but a decisive summons from the outer world. Miss Anson put down her knitting and listened. She sat upstairs now, making her rheumatism an excuse for avoiding the rooms below. Her interests had insensibly adjusted themselves to the perspective of her neighbors' lives, and she wondered, as the bell re-echoed, if it could mean that Mrs. Hemingway's baby had come. Conjecture had time to ripen into certainty, and she was limping toward the closet where her cloak and bonnet hung when her little maid fluttered in with the announcement, "A gentleman to see the house." "The house?" "Yes'm, I don't know what he means," faltered the messenger, whose memory did not embrace the period when such announcements were a daily part of the domestic routine. Miss Anson glanced at the proffered card. The name it bore, Mr. George Corby, was unknown to her, but the blood rose to her languid cheek. "Hand me my Mechlin cap, Katy," she said, trembling a little, as she laid aside her walking-stick. She put her cap on before the mirror, with rapid, unsteady touches. "Did you draw up the library blinds?" she breathlessly asked. She had gradually built up a wall of commonplace between herself and her illusions, but at the first summons of the past, filial passion swept away the frail barriers of expediency. She walked downstairs so hurriedly that her stick clicked like a girlish heel, but in the hall she paused, wondering nervously if Katy had put a match to the fire. The autumn air was cold, and she had the reproachful vision of a visitor with elderly ailments shivering by her inhospitable hearth. She thought instinctively of the stranger as a survivor of the days when such a visit was a part of the young enthusiast's itinerary. The fire was unlit, and the room forbiddingly cold, but the figure which, as Miss Anson entered, turned from a lingering scrutiny of the bookshelves, was that of a fresh-eyed, sanguine youth, clearly independent of any artificial caloric. She stood still a moment, feeling herself the victim of some anterior impression that made this robust presence an insubstantial thing, but the young man advanced with an air of genial assurance which rendered him at once more real and more reminiscent. "Why, this, you know," he exclaimed, "is simply immense." The words, which did not immediately present themselves as slang to Miss Anson's unaccustomed ear, echoed with an odd familiarity through the academic silence. "The room, you know, I mean," he explained with a comprehensive gesture. "These jolly portraits in the books. That's the old gentleman himself over the mantelpiece, I suppose, and the elms outside, and the whole business. I do like an incongruous background, don't you?" His hostess was silent. No one but Hewlett Winslow had ever spoken of her grandfather as the old gentleman. "It's 100 times better than I could have hoped," her visitor continued with a cheerful disregard of her silence. "The seclusion, the remoteness, the philosophic atmosphere, there's so little of that kind of flavor left. I should have simply hated to find that he had lived over a grocery, you know. I had the deuce of a time finding out where he did live." He began again, after another glance of parenthetical enjoyment. "But finally I got on the trail through some old book on Brook Farm. I was bound I'd get the environment right before I did my article." Miss Anson, by this time, had recovered sufficient self-possession to seat herself and assign a chair to her visitor. "Do I understand," she asked slowly, following his rapid eye about the room, "that you intend to write an article about my grandfather?" "That's what I'm here for," Mr. Corby genially responded. "That is, if you're willing to help me, for I can't get on without your help," he added, with a confident smile. There was another pause, during which Miss Anson noticed a fleck of dust on the faded leather of the writing table and a fresh spot of discoloration in the right-hand upper corner of Raphael Morgan's Parnassus. "Then you believe in him," she said, looking up. She could not tell what had prompted her. The words rushed out irresistibly. "Believe in him?" Corby cried, springing to his feet. "Believe in Orestes Anson? Why, I believe he's simply the greatest, the most stupendous, the most phenomenal figure we've got." The color rose to Miss Anson's brow. Her heart was beating passionately. She kept her eyes fixed on the young man's face, as though it might vanish if she looked away. You mean to say this in your article?" she asked. "Say it? Why, the facts will say it," he exulted. "The baldest kind of a statement would make it clear. When a man is as big as that, he doesn't need a pedestal." Miss Anson sighed. "People used to say that when I was young," she murmured. "But now—" Her visitor stared. "When you were young? But how did they know? When the thing hung fire as it did, when the whole edition was thrown back on his hands." "The whole edition? What edition?" It was Miss Anson's turn to stare. "Why, of his pamphlet, the one thing that counts, that survives, that makes him what he is. For heaven's sake," he tragically adjured her, "don't tell me there isn't a copy of it left." Miss Anson was trembling slightly. I don't think I understand what you mean," she faltered, less bewildered by his vehemence than by the strange sense of coming on an unexplored region in the very heart of her dominion. "Why, his account of the Amphioxus, of course. You can't mean that his family didn't know about it, that you don't know about it? I came across it by the merest accident myself in a letter of vindication that he wrote in 1830 to an old scientific paper, but I understood there were journals, early journals. There must be references to it somewhere in the 20s. He must have been at least 10 or 12 years ahead of Yarrell, and he saw the whole significance of it too. He saw where it led to. As I understand it, he actually anticipated in his pamphlet St. Hilary's theory of the universal type, and supported the hypothesis by describing the notochord of the Amphioxus as a cartilaginous vertebral column. The specialists of the day jeered at him, of course, as the specialists in Gettystam jeered at the plant metamorphosis. As far as I can make out, the anatomists and zoologists were down on Dr. Anson to a man. That was why his cowardly publishers went back on their bargain. But the pamphlet must be here somewhere. He writes as though in his first disappointment he had destroyed the whole edition, but surely there must be at least one copy left." His scientific jargon was as bewildering as his slang, and there were even moments in his discourse when Miss Anson ceased to distinguish between them, but the suspense with which he continued to gaze on her acted as a challenge to her scattered thoughts. "The Amphioxus," she murmured, half rising. "It's an animal, isn't it? A fish? Yes, I think I remember." She sank back with the inward look of one who retraces some lost line of association. Gradually the distance cleared. The details started into life. In her researches for the biography, she had patiently followed every ramification of her subject, and one of those overgrown paths now led her back to the episode in question. The great Orestes' title of doctor had in fact not been merely the spontaneous tribute of a national admiration. He had actually studied medicine in his youth, and his diaries, as his granddaughter now recalled, showed that he had passed through a brief phase of anatomical ardor before his attention was diverted to supersensual problems. It had indeed seemed to Paulina, as she scanned those early pages, that they revealed a spontaneity, a freshness of feeling somehow absent from his later lucubrations, as though this one emotion had reached him directly, the others through some intervening medium. In the excess of her commemorative zeal, she had even struggled through the unintelligible pamphlet to which a few lines of the journal had bitterly directed her. But the subject and the phraseology were alien to her and unconnected with her conception of the great man's genius, and after a hurried perusal she had averted her thoughts from the episode as from a revelation of failure. At length she rose a little unsteadily, supporting herself against the writing table. She looked hesitatingly about the room, then she drew a key from her old-fashioned reticule and unlocked a drawer beneath one of the bookcases. Young Corby watched her breathlessly. With a tremulous hand she turned over the dusty documents that seemed to fill the drawer. "Is this it?" she said, holding out a thin, discolored volume. He seized it with a gasp. "Oh, by George," he said, dropping into the nearest chair. She stood observing him strangely as his eye devoured the mouldy pages. "Is this the only copy left?" he asked at length, looking up for a moment as a thirsty man lifts his head from his glass. "I think it must be. I found it long ago among some old papers that my aunts were burning up after my grandmother's death. They said it was of no use, that he had always meant to destroy the whole edition, and that I ought to respect his wishes. But it was something he had written. To burn it was like shutting a door against his voice, against something he had once wished to say that nobody ever listened to. I wanted him to feel that I was always here, ready to listen, even when others hadn't thought it worthwhile, and so I kept the pamphlet, meaning to carry out his wish and destroy it before my death. Her visitor gave a groan of retrospective anguish. And but for today, you would have. I should have thought it my duty. Oh, by George, he repeated, subdued afresh by the inadequacy of speech. She continued to watch him in silence. At length he jumped up and impulsively caught her by both hands. He's bigger and bigger, he almost shouted. He simply leads the field. You'll help me go to the bottom of this, won't you? We must turn out all the papers, letters, journals, memoranda. He must have made notes. He must have left some record of what led up to this. We must leave nothing unexplored. By Jove, he cried, looking up with her, with his bright, convincing smile. Do you know you're the granddaughter of a great man? Her color flickered like a girl's. Are you sure of him? She whispered, as though putting him on guard against a possible betrayal of trust. Sure, my dear lady. He measured her again with his quick, confident glance. Don't you believe in him? She drew back with a confused murmur. I used to. She had left her hands in his. Their pressure seemed to send a warm current to her heart. It ruined my life, she cried with sudden passion. He looked up at her perplexity. I gave up everything, she went on wildly, to keep him alive. I sacrificed myself, others. I nursed his glory in my bosom, and it died, and left me here alone. She paused and gathered her courage with a gasp. Don't make the same mistake, she warned him. He shook his head, still smiling. No danger of that. You're not alone, my dear lady. He's here with you. He's come back to you today. Don't you see what's happened? Don't you see that it's your love that has kept him alive? If you'd abandoned your post for an instant, let things pass into other hands, if your wonderful tendencies hadn't perpetually kept guard, this must have been irretrievably lost. He laid his hands on the pamphlet, and then he would have been dead. Oh, she said, don't tell me too suddenly. And she turned away and sank into a chair. The young man stood watching her in an awed silence. For a long time she sat motionless with her face hidden, and he thought she must be weeping. At length he said, almost shyly, You'll let me come back then? You'll help me work this thing out? She rose calmly and held out her hand. I'll help you, she declared. I'll come tomorrow then. Can we get to work early? As early as you please. 8 o'clock then, he said briskly. You'll have the papers ready. I'll have everything ready, she added with a half-playful hesitancy, and the fire will be lit for you. He went out with his bright nod. She walked to the window and watched his buoyant figure hastening down the elm-shaded street. When she turned back into the empty room, she looked as though youth had touched her on the lips. The end. The Angel at the Grave was initially published in Scribner's in 1901, and then later that same year it was published in her collection of works called Crucial Instances. Her being Edith Wharton, if that wasn't clear. And Edith Wharton's whole life story is very interesting and sorta kinda ties back into Angel at the Grave. Edith grew up pretty wealthy, and when I say pretty wealthy, you know how people say, oh, you're just keeping up with the Joneses when people buy, you know, houses and cars beyond their means in order to put up a facade that they are wealthy and they, you know, for the neighbors. Edith Wharton's maiden name is Jones. Like, they're literally who you're trying to keep up with, is Edith Wharton's family. That's how wealthy and like well known for being fabulously wealthy Edith Wharton was. But as a part of that elevated visibility, social status, which she kind of sort of touches on a little bit at the beginning, where she talks about how the house was just kind of open to the whole world, you know, that kind of visibility. Because of that heightened visibility, there were a lot of things that Edith was somewhat forbidden from doing, including reading and writing fiction. She started off her writing career writing poetry mostly because her mother thought that fiction was vulgar. How dare you? I'm assuming that's exactly how she talked. I don't know. Edith didn't actually publish her first short story until she was 40, much like Paulina. And that kind of superficiality of wealth and fabulousness in front of everyone else kind of colors Edith's writing as well, because she tends to be a little sarcastic, a little bit satirical, you know, kind of like wink and a nod to the audience kind of thing. And we do see that a bit in The Angel at the Grave because of the character that we meet. It's like a blink and you'll miss it character in the middle, the publisher's grandson, who also knew her grandfather and is a legacy in the publishing company. Except instead of preserving his grandfather's legacy of like, yes, we will publish our friends and we don't really care. He's, you know, a fast-talking businessman. He's gonna keep that legacy alive, dang it. Whereas Paulina just kind of assumes that the work is done, that Orestes, like, his work doesn't need to continually be, you know, promoted and whatever because it's so valuable. Whereas fans of books like Lord of the Rings will know that every time you re-promote the work, every time you republish the work, it stays in the public consciousness longer. We studying classic literature see this very frequently, where there will be a story or a character that was just in your face in the public consciousness, everybody loved it, and then it just kind of it's not as popular as it once was, just because whoever was in charge of the rights just didn't really renew them, didn't really republish it. And I feel like, to me, the thing that I find, I don't know, that most interesting is the right word, like just kind of very compelling about this story, is the end and the uncertainty of the end. The title of the story is Angel at the Grave. And at the end, that's really all Paulina is. Despite all of this work that she did, in spite of all this interaction that she tried to convey and understanding her grandfather's literature, and way early on this story it says, you know, oh, the sisters weren't smart enough to understand it, so they don't get to. And then it turns out at the end, Paulina doesn't understand the enduring thing that's going to form his legacy. If Corby writing this article comes to pass, and it comes to pass in the way that he thinks that it will, and this is going to elevate Orestes' profile amongst fish enthusiasts or whatever, Paulina doesn't understand, I don't understand a word of it, but Paulina doesn't understand anything about that, and I don't know that it matters if you're holding on to this familial legacy, does it? And at the end, you get the sense that she doesn't want to feel like her life was wasted, and all of a sudden it comes crashing down on her that, oh my god, it was. My life is wasted, but we can continue on with this the Amphioxus or whatever. But that ties Paulina back into the title. Because she's not the groundskeeper who tends to the grave. She's not, you know, the mourners who come and like leave flowers. She's the inanimate, mute statue where all she does is stand vigil over this tomb of the legacy of Orestes Anson. Man, that's a downer when you think about it. And also I found it very interesting that there's that uncertainty at the end, because even if this guy publishes this thing about this science fish that she has no idea what the heck it is, who even knows if that's gonna revive Orestes' reputation at all? We don't know. It could be a complete waste of time too. I guess I do like the ones that are kind of low-key depressing, huh? So if you have any thoughts on this story, and I'm sure you do, please leave a comment down in the video description box. I would love to hear from you. And while you're down there, subscribe so that next week we can meet up here and read more classic literature. I'll see y'all next time.